So, conventional stuff to talk about in relation to assessment. I expressed it in terms of the three sides of a cube. So, in terms of some of it's formative, that is assessment for learning, and some of it is summative, and I'm skipping through those things because really all I've done is I've just introduced you to 12 items of jargon, which has not actually increased your understanding of assessment at all, has it? It does mean if we had a multiple choice exam, you'd probably be able to pass it if I come into a bit more detail. But because this is what happens to us, let's say when the assessment method reaches back into the content, and it leads us to fragment it all and to say these 12 words are the critical things that you need to know about assessment. They're not. It doesn't really matter whether you can ever remember these words or not. And whether it's really assessing the outcome. I want to look at that in a bit more detail. So, looking at this sort of diagrammatically, one of the big issues with assessment is that there is a process of validity creep, or rather creep away from validity, in terms of what you're training for and how you assess it. And it goes something like this. It depends obviously on what it is that you're training somebody for, but thinking within a broadly vocational area. We start off with what the area of practice actually requires. Now, actually this will be set down probably in some documents from industry sector skills councils, which actually specify the requirements in a particular area of industry. If you talk to somebody who's involved with the sector skills councils, they will immediately say, well, actually, of course, that's what they produce. All these reports and these sets of standards are a reflection of the bureaucratic process that they've been through, and these teams of consultants they've got in to break down particular occupations and look at the skill and knowledge levels which they embody, and they've written it all up. So already what the area of practice actually requires is what we see of it isn't quite what the actual practitioners want, and very often it reflects more what the employers want. But derived from what the area of practice actually requires, we then send people on courses to learn about that. And that's what the course sets out to teach something which is not quite the same as what the area of practice requires. Partly because, for example, a bit in further education nowadays, big emphasis on functional skills. Anybody stuck with the functional skills agenda? Say something about how it impacts on the rest of your teaching?
We have to identify where functional skills are. Not only do they have to attend as part, because it's a study programme now, not a course, so they have to attend a functional skills session even if they already have a level 2, which means next year I'll have people doing A-level maths because they have to do a part of functional skills within their study programme. And secondly, we have to identify in every single session, every single thing we deliver, how and why we are supporting and encouraging the development of functional skills in English, Maths and ICT.
Yeah. So you've got a situation arising in which basically you've got that subset of what the course what the sector requires. It isn't as if the course only teaches a part of it. Instead, they also teach other stuff which is not what the sector requires. And so you've got a continuing process of drift. There is an excellent essay by a marvellous sociologist called Howard Becker, who's chiefly known to generations of undergraduates since the 1960s for his famous How to Smoke Pot essay, formerly titled On Becoming a Marijuana User, on 1965?
63.
63, is it?
63.
Yeah. However,
it's well worth reading.
Yeah.
Seriously, read it. It's brilliant.
He's also done a lot on sociology of education, and one of his papers is from 1972. It's called "Why School is a Lousy Place to Learn Anything In." By school, he is really talking about vocational schools. Further education, so he's talking about trades, he's talking about hairdressing, he's talking about construction and things like that. And he says, of course, the first thing that happens is that the school, somebody knows what they need to learn, and the employers and people know what the sector requires, but the school goes about it in a different kind of way. For example, they start teaching the simple stuff first and build up to the more complicated stuff. It's not the way things work in the real world. Everything happens at once. And you may be mentored by somebody who says, well, don't bother about that, that's too much for the moment, just concentrate on this little bit. But even so, things happen in context. The school takes it all out of context in order to teach it, and then expects somebody, when they finish school, to put it all together again in another kind of context. I'm just guessing that there's something like 80% overlap between each of these stages. But it doesn't stop there, because what the course actually does teach is not necessarily the same as what it sets out to teach. Because we all know occasions in which bits couldn't be covered because something took too long, or in fact we covered something a lot faster, so we managed to put something else in. And as I say, the emphasis on things like functional skills lead more emphasis to be placed on that, and sometimes there are some things which are very difficult to get at, to actually teach. I used to work in the education and training in social work and social care, and even on practical placements there were lots of things which students never got a chance to have a go at on the course, perhaps partly because of the ethics of it. I mean, dealing with challenging behaviour in people with learning disabilities, well, you can't deliver it on demand on a placement. You can't sort of poke somebody with a stick until they go berserk and then say, this is how we handle it. So there's all kinds of considerations like that. So there may be gaps in people's knowledge just simply because of the practicalities of it. And then, of course, the course has its own assessment regulations, and so it sets out to examine some of this stuff. And, only some of it, because some of it is almost unexaminable. Because, for example, of the reliability and consistency issue. Assessing some elements of practice are difficult when everybody's practical situation on practice placements and so on is different. So we create sets of standards and checklists and things like that. But a lot of what they get at is only the most basic stuff, which you find in practically any situation. So have big arguments when somebody, powers that be, decided that residential social work and field social work, social workers who go and visit people in their homes and manage things out in the community, are basically the same thing, because the core of social work is common to all of it. Well, yeah, that may be true, but what about the specialist bits? And what about bits that they don't share? And when the qualification structure doesn't recognise that anymore. So that's what the course sets out to assess in terms of its curriculum, and then there's what it actually does assess. And again, that's for similar reasons. I won't go into it all over again. It is what happens. So if you take the middle bit away, and I admit this is a little bit too neat and polemical really, but what the area of practice actually requires and what the course actually ends up assessing, sometimes they've got a tiny bit of overlap. And interestingly enough, if some people just scrape through the assessment and get the qualification almost despite themselves, I've known it on occasion to be the case that actually there was no overlap at all, in that we were producing people who technically got the qualification and couldn't do the job, to put it simply. And that was nobody's fault. It's something which but it does require constant attention and vigilance, because that's the natural process of drift. And it's built into the system, as it were. And that's why the vigilance needs to be exerted over the assessment regime, and you're looking very dubious.
So why you need feedback then to the course designers from the workplace to say whether the employees are actually producing the goods because they haven't been taught properly, or
it comes down to a lack of evaluation, doesn't it, of the actual course for what you're trying to mean.
Yeah, it does, yes, in part. Problem, of course, with the evaluation is that in what it's like in your situation, but within higher education, for example, you will have course evaluations in professional areas. We're talking about medicine, we're talking about law, we're talking about nursing and social work and so on, all of which there will be representatives of professional bodies, and there will be academics and external academics involved in the review process. It's often assumed that the representatives of the professional bodies see things in exactly the same kind of way as the employers do, which is not always the case. I mean, they often have an agenda. There's I'm not sure what the stage of the debate is now about nursing, but certainly a few years ago, a big push to make nursing an all-graduate profession. At the time, 3-year qualified nursing graduates and 2-year qualified diploma graduates working alongside each other, still technically in the same role. Now, this push to make it an all-graduate profession actually caused a hell of a row, because it was at about the same time as the Staffordshire hospitals debacle was becoming apparent, and so there was a lot of correspondence in the papers and so on, and particularly in the professional press about that, saying that it's because of this academic emphasis and making them all graduates that they're not prepared to go to the trouble of giving somebody a glass of water when they're dying of thirst, literally. And so there's been a push in that kind of area, which has pushed it away from what the job actually requires, in the interests of professionalisation and increasing status and goodness knows what. Yes, it's evaluation, but the evaluation needs to come from beyond vested interests, and it's very difficult to specify what that is. We've got this sort of divergence between the world of education and training and its assessment and the actual practice.